Hi, I'm Tara Palmeri, your feared and fearless political journalist. There is just so much news coming out of Congress this week. Speaker Mike Johnson passed the funding bill with just 2 votes to spare, and now all the Democrats that I've been speaking to, from liberals to moderates, are furious with Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. Did he have any other option than to vote for the bill that would keep the government open? Just what kind of pickle was he in? Was there an off-ramp? On this show, I break it all down with Republican Governor of North Dakota, Kelly Armstrong, who I met when he was the lone congressman representing the state. We talk about how Trump's tariffs are impacting the soybean farmers in North Dakota, especially since their exports go to China, who we are engaged in a trade war with. We also talk about the realities of passing Trump's tax reform bill in a budget-neutral way, especially when the president has made promises like no tax on tips, overtime, and bringing back state and local tax deductions. How does it all add up without increasing the deficit? Let's get down to it. Governor Armstrong, thanks so much for coming on the show. Last time we spoke, it was the Republican National Convention. We were sitting in the stands. I was trying to record a podcast with the two of us. You were still a congressman at that point, and my memory gave out. Not my actual memory, though. That wouldn't be that surprising, but the memory on my Zoom card. And so we lost that, and it was a really great conversation. So I'm happy that you actually came back on the pod.
Yeah, you're in the middle of all the DC stuff. I'm in the middle of a legislative session in North Dakota, but it's always great to see you.
Yeah, what's it like to be governor now?
The meetings start when I say they start, so it's cool.
Oh,
you know, I
Chief
served
Executor.
I served in the state Senate and then obviously Congress. So somebody else was always in charge of my calendar. Now we get to be in charge of our calendar.
Weren't you the sole member of Congress, though, of
Yeah.
North Dakota?
I always used to say I did
Yeah.
the job of 34 Texans.
Okay. I got to ask you, because you were in the Republican Study Committee. You have been close to leadership. You followed them closely. You knew Mike Johnson well, right? Speaker of the House. How did he pull it off last week by passing that continuing resolution with just 2 votes? I think a lot of people, there were a lot of doubters out there.
Yeah, I mean, not the least of which is a guy who's been there for 6 years and couldn't get. I mean, they're just Republicans in Congress that knee jerk against voting against any CR. I think one, Mike has a great relationship at a personal level with a lot of people. They trust him, but two, I mean, I think when the president of the United States gets involved and says, I want you all to pass it, I think the real vote was the budget resolution, right? That kind of teed up for this. And I think it caught the Democrats flat-footed because they didn't think it would happen that way.
And so you also think that the power of Elon Musk and his X account and Trump's very stocked political armor may help as well. Like, you know, Tony Fabrizio and Chris LaCivita, these outside groups that are applying pressure, saying we're going to primary you. Although Thomas Massey said, he's of Kentucky, he's always the no vote on budget, on continuing resolutions and funding the government. He was like, bring it, because he's actually fought off a few of these primary threats from the right. He's like, I'm more MAGA than you are. Pretty bold. But do you think that had anything to do with it as well?
Well, I think I don't know necessarily about the outside groups. I think different members of Congress respond to different types of pressures. But I think when the president, you've got a 2-vote majority essentially, and I mean, Thomas is my friend and he can frustrate me a lot, but that shouldn't have surprised anybody. Thomas has always been in that position for as long as I've known him. He's remarkably consistent, so I think he'll be okay as well. But I just think, one, the combined trust that Mike has garnered with the conference, and two, the president weighing in saying this is what the White House wants. I think those two combinations got it. And what I'm hopeful is in the future, some of our friends realize that if we stick together, we can actually do some really good things.
You know, the one thing that I do think is interesting is that they essentially passed the Biden budget that they refused to pass in December. It's the same continuing resolution.
Yeah, I think that's where the Democrats really got themselves into trouble when they're talking about this partisan budget deal and they can't support it and they can't do any of this. And all of a sudden everybody's looking at it and going like, you guys literally voted for this in December. But I think the game changer to that is coming in and actually doing what you said you were going to do, which is, I mean, for lack of a better term, upset the apple cart, so to speak, with the permanent bureaucracy in D.C.
You mean by DOGE?
Yeah, and it turns out all of these agencies are under the executive branch and not their own independent universes. That Congress has kind of treated them like that for the last, I don't know, 20 years. And now the head of the executive branch said, you know what, we're going to take over the executive branch again.
Well, that's still to be decided in the courts. I think a lot of these agencies are fighting back, including Voice of America. I've been writing a lot about that in my newsletter. You should check it out. I used to be an intern at Voice of America, so I have a lot of connections there. I was there on election night in 2008, covering it as a young college student at American University. Well, not a young one. I guess I was a senior at that point. So,
we were all young in college.
right. Okay. Chuck Schumer, he's not having a great week. He's getting so much shit for voting for the continuing resolution to keep the government open, along with a handful of other Democrats, that he had to cancel his book tour.
Yeah, I just read that. That's,
security threats.
Yeah, the protest mentality. I find that unfortunate, even for that kind of stuff. But I think to a little bit, when you thrive on that kind of politics in general, I think when it comes back, it's a little shite and fraud. But I think Senator Schumer was in a really, I think the unique position with this is, I think the Democrats have been caught incredibly flat-footed since Trump got sworn in. They decided this is where they were going to pick the fight. It's a lot easier to do in the House. Right, I was in the minority for 4 years in the House. It's easy to show up and vote no. When you get onto the Senate side and you are basically like what we just talked about, voting for the exact same CR you all voted for in December, I think a lot of his
slightly different. There were some changes, like they changed the defense spending around and for some
it wasn't Christmas treed up. There were some anomalies in it, and they're never identical, but it was substantially the same one. But I have a feeling that Senator Schumer had a lot of vote no and hope yes members of his own caucus on the Senate side, and we'll see if there's. It feels like there might be a little more long-term momentum to this push, but really where you'll end up seeing it is if it's coming from Democratic senators. Whether it's coming from House members, Democrats on the House side calling for it, I've never found that to necessarily translate over to the Senate side.
Okay, so by Saturday morning, I think that the hatred towards Chuck Schumer obviously is uniting moderates and liberals, because by Saturday morning, I got a text from a major Democratic donor. He's a moderate, and he texted me, "I have never been a fan of AOC and strongly disagree with her on most issues, but I would seriously consider supporting her if she challenges Chuck Schumer." That's how desperate many of us are for change in the leadership of the Democratic Party. It's going to be difficult for Schumer or any Democrat who voted for the CR to recover from this. Personally, I will never support them again. And given the lack of leadership and strategy, it's becoming harder by the day to keep supporting the party until I see real change. My wallet is closed. Meanwhile, I talked to a leadership source yesterday who told me that Schumer's playing the long game and that there was no off-ramp if they shut down the government. And obviously, Senator Fetterman said the same thing too. He voted to pass the bill. He said there was no off-ramp. But, this person also said that these Democrats that are angry at Schumer are going through the 5 stages of grief, and one of them is denial. This person's words, not mine. You were in Congress. Do you really believe there was no off-ramp for Chuck Schumer if they shut down the government?
As somebody who has firmly believed that Republicans always get blamed for a shutdown, as governor, you start thinking about what happens during a shutdown and what you have to apply to. I think the Democrats lose that shutdown fight, and I don't think they did have an off-ramp. And I think there were a couple. If I was giving them political advice, I would say, your rhetoric in the 5 days leading up to the shutdown was going to be impossible to deliver on. And then in the last 48 hours before the shutdown, when John Thune can go out and said they haven't made an offer yet. Like, what are we debating? They haven't even made an offer to us. All I know is they're in these closed meetings yelling at each other nonstop, and then they come out. So I think 2 things. One, if it was in the House, I think it would be a much more hot button issue, because these elections are starting now. I've already seen some of my colleagues announcing for re-election. But Senator Schumer is not even up, I think, until 2028. The long game is what the long game is. But the one thing I would agree on with that donor is...
But he's up for leadership in 2026.
Sure. But I think we get caught up in 48-hour news cycles, and I always just feel like people end up coming home. The question is going to be if they can actually mount an effective strategy, because I haven't seen one yet. I mean, all cutting the same video and swearing and sounding like you're tough is not really an appropriate way in which to mount a minority opposition. So,
I mean, the Republicans were pretty crazy when they were in the minority too.
I was
Remember
there.
Marjorie Taylor Greene. Yeah,
Yeah.
They're pretty nuts. Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert like getting into cat fights with Nancy Mace. I mean, there was a lot of carnival going on there, especially during those hours when they ousted Kevin McCarthy.
Obviously, I wasn't a huge fan of that move. I felt like every time we went onto the floor of the House, before we went in to take another vote, we stepped on a rake and then went in and had a self-induced, I still think that was just a terrible thing. But I would also say the first 2 years in the minority under,
Matt Gaetz.
But we had,
do I need to say anything else?
I think that's interesting, though, because you're talking about the last 2 years in the minority, not the first 2 years, right? The first 2 years were Schiff's secret bunker, impeachment, and oversight. And by the time we got to the presidential election, nobody was even talking about Bob Mueller anymore. So we're a long ways away from when all
Bob,
of this got...
he put out a report that said that he didn't find collusion. So I think everyone had to drop it. So I want to talk about tariffs and the DOGE sledgehammer.
Yeah.
Half of like the U.S.'s exports of soybeans are grown in North Dakota, where you're governor, and they're sold to China. So I can't imagine that this trade war isn't having a major impact on your constituents. And I also learned that a vast majority of fertilizer that North Dakota uses is bought from Canada, where we're also in the middle of a trade war. What's going on? Are farmers telling you that they're worried about tariffs? Are they feeling it already?
So when I first ran for Congress in 2018, China put a bunch of retaliatory tariffs on Midwest ag Trump-supporting states. So I've been through the soybean fight. And our farmers and ranchers out here, I mean, this is Trump country. At the same time, we're a commodity-based economy. We need markets. I think it's a little easier to deal with in the short term, particularly since there hasn't under the last 4 years, we haven't had a single trade deal done. Like after USMCA was signed, when I first got to Congress in 2018, there hasn't been a real trade deal done either way. But we also farm right to the border. We have a different relationship with Canada, I think, than most other states. And so as governor, I keep in touch with my colleagues on the state or on the provincial side in Canada and make sure we have those relationships going. And we will always keep the White House informed of what we are seeing and where we see stress points coming on some of this stuff. But I'm a pretty big China hawk. I spent enough time in D.C. understanding what China is doing. I think the more that the United States can build legitimate off-ramps from the Chinese Communist Party, I think that is going to be better for the long-term national security of this country. I do want to make sure that we continue to have as good a relationships as we possibly can with our Canadian partners.
What are the stress points that you're seeing?
North Dakota is unique. Other than Vermont a little bit, we're actually the only state that really farms to the border. A little bit in eastern Montana, but it's mostly pasture land, and then it's forest and mountains and urban. So we have families. I had a northern border hearing here when I was still on judiciary. We have families that farm on both sides of the border. We interact on both sides of the border. So we just have very close relationships with our Canadian friends, and we want to make sure that in the grand scheme of resetting the United States' place in global trade, that we're not ruining those generational relationships.
And have you reported anything to the White House yet?
Yeah, we were out there for 3 days, and we're honest with them. We want you.
What are you telling them?
Telling them that you go deal with the best deal you can get, but at the end of the day, we're going to have. We have relationships, and we want you to be aware of what they are, and making sure that we can continue to do that.
Are they offering any USDA subsidies? Because that was what helped the first time around with the tariffs.
I saw Secretary Collins had talked about some of that. It'd be really great if we could get Congress to get a farm bill passed. We're about 1.5 years behind on that. That's necessary even before this happens. But when you get through into that point, we'll have to talk about how some of that looks and if they're moving forward.
Is the DOGE axe coming for USDA?
Not so much that I've heard of. I mean, and I think that's one of the things we also really try and communicate, not just with the White House, but with the cabinet secretaries, is that, we got a lot of empty federal buildings in DC that people, the work-life balances seem to be tilted out of line. You don't even have to go to me. Mayor Bowser will tell you the same thing. But our on-the-ground people, like with USDA out here, have always been really good. And we do really send that message. We're like, don't let the DC bubble fight about the bureaucracy get caught up with the people that are doing really good work on the ground out here.
Yeah, speaking of DOGE cuts, are you feeling the downstream economic effects? Because obviously you do have USDA workers in North Dakota and federal workers in North Dakota.
There's been a couple probationary, employees and stuff that we've been reached out to about, but for the most part, a lot of it seems like noise at this point. That doesn't mean it's not coming, but I just tell everybody who's worried about it, whether it's some of my own agencies like DEQ, Department of Mineral Resources, they have real federal connotations. My answer is, don't worry so much about the rhetoric. When there's a specific problem, let us know, because we will reach out and try and get an answer to that specific problem.
Have you gotten anyone's jobs back?
We have. I'm not really sure we've had any that we've asked for back at this point. We had a couple cut from, I know there is a BIA position that we think the person doing it was pretty good, and we're working on that.
What's BIA?
Bureau of Indian Affairs.
Oh, okay.
So.
And you're trying to get them their job back.
Well, we have relayed the message. Lucky for me, I know the Secretary of Interior.
Oh, yeah, right. Doug Burgum, your former governor.
Yeah. So, and they've been great. The one difference, and by the way, when we were out there for NGA and RGA, I think one of the things is and we noticed this during the first Trump administration, you don't always get the answers you want from any administration, Democratic administration, Republican administration, but their lines of communication have been just so exceptionally better. And we even noticed that in the first term. And the fact that you can actually get a live human on the phone to express your concerns has really been beneficial.
I really want to get back to USDA, though. Are you sure that you are going to get the funds from USDA to help you with the tariffs?
Well, no, I'm not sure we're going to get the funds from USDA. I don't think anything that hasn't been funded yet is part of that. I think that'll be a decision made through first of all, it's new funds. I know the administration does a lot of great things, but eventually Congress has to approve the money.
Yeah, I want to talk about tax cuts, right? Because that's the big bill. Tax reform.
Yeah.
That's what Trump really wants. And of course, that includes energy, which affects you, and immigration too. They're looking to add money to counter migration at the border. When they tried to pass this, when you were in Congress in 2017, there were, I believe, 17 Republican defectors who decided not to vote for Trump's tax reform bill. Now there's only room for 3. And, both chambers, they have to agree on the budget. The Senate parliamentarian has to decide if it's budget neutral, since they have to pass it through reconciliation. And President Trump has promised a lot of gimmies, like no tax on tips, no tax on overtime. It just doesn't really seem to add up in terms of making it budget neutral. Plus, you don't have people there with institutional wonky knowledge about how this works. You had Speaker Paul Ryan at the time, who was obsessed with tax reform. That was his legacy and his baby. And I'm just sort of wondering, what do you think about this? Do you think that they're actually going to be able to pull this off and pass tax reform?
Yeah, I do. I think the first question is you got to answer SALT.
Wait, I just want to slow down for a second. SALT is state and local tax deduction. And there are a number of Republicans that come from states that pay very high state and local taxes, like New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and they use that. They deduct their federal taxes from their state and local taxes to make up for that.
Red members in blue states. Yeah.
Yeah, and they lost that ability to do that.
But it's
with Trump's first reform bill, and they want it back.
Yeah.
They want those deductions back.
Or they want to compromise on it. And I think that's the first question, because those are your majority makers, right? Lee Zeldin, who's now the Secretary of EPA, he didn't pull off the race for governor, but he is the reason he's as big a reason as anything.
From Long Island. He's from the Hamptons, right?
Yeah. But he's as big a reason.
He's from Montauk.
Yeah. But he's as big a reason as anybody why we actually have a Republican majority. But those Republican members in California and New York and those areas, once you get SALT figured out, then I think the second question is, Ways and Means and the Senate figuring out what the numbers are. And once SALT figures out, you get the extenders. I mean, I don't think the fight about whether it's permanent or just another extender is actually going to be. I mean, they'll end up negotiating that out. And then I think, again, it comes down to, I think we've shown both with the budget resolution and with the CR, if the president goes all in on this and they get a plan that he supports, I think we can pass it. With SALT as the caveat, because that's existential to those guys. But I think President Trump actually.
But then how do you make it budget neutral?
Well,
is it like you make a bill that's just like too big to fail, but then how does it become budget neutral? That's the problem.
Well, I think
you can't also do no tax on tips and no tax on overtime. It's like, it just, the numbers don't add up.
Those pieces are the ones that I think fill in later in the process. I think it's one, like the PACE program, the small business pass through, figuring out what those dollars amount. I think the first fight is really going to be whether or not how they determine to budget this and what they use as the baseline. And then the second fight's going to be SALT. And then once they get those two things figured out, I think they'll get momentum to get everything else.
It doesn't feel like there's a lot of momentum, though. I feel like everyone is talking about DOGE and tariffs. And before tax cuts were passed in 2017, it was like tax cuts, tax cuts, tax cuts, tax cuts. And, there's a lot of questions over whether this is really going to cause like an economic spurt like they claim that it will, because it's not really a new tax cut. It's just an extension of the existing tax cuts.
But the flip side of that is the failure is it would actually be a tax increase once these cuts expire.
Yeah, so, I mean, you're right. If they expire, it would be a tax increase, and nobody wants a tax increase. Obviously, Democrats are going to say if they touch entitlements in any way, that's going to be huge. And Elon Musk just went on Larry Kudlow's show and said we have to cut the waste and fraud of entitlements, and he kind of garbled the waste and fraud part. So that didn't go over so well. And also he's called Social Security a Ponzi scheme. But, Democrats are going to spin this as, and maybe rightfully so, as a big break for corporations, and for tech billionaires and for Trump's rich friends. Like, how do you counter that narrative?
Well, and I think that, by the way, I think there's some voices on the Republican side that would say make these tax cuts go more to small businesses, more to that, and not deal with the international, the international corporations and all of that. So I'm not entirely sure that all of that works out, but I would say on the Elon Musk versus Trump on Social Security and Medicaid, after spending, 2 years as the state party chair when Trump got elected, 2 years in Congress during his first term, and listening to him talk over the entire time, I'm going to take the president at his word when he says Social Security and Medicare are off the table. Now, if you're going to go in on waste, fraud, and abuse and deal with some of that stuff, I think there are appropriate places in which you can do that. But the president's been pretty clear for as long as I've known him that Social Security and Medicare are off the table. So we'll see what it ends up looking like.
It's just the numbers he's thrown out there in terms of like saying how much fraud and abuse is like. Even the administrator of the Social Security Department picked by Donald Trump says that there are not that many people who are over 100 years old collecting those checks like they claim.
Well, yeah, and like the $800 billion they asked the House Energy and Commerce Committee to cut, like if that is your number, I mean, the reality is you have to get into those programs in some way. Otherwise, there's no other place to do it. So those are the real rubber meets the road conversations that have to occur. But at the end of the day, I mean, that's going to come down to, President Trump and Susie Wiles and saying, where are you at? And I mean, where are you trimming and where are you actually cutting? Because I don't think, I've never heard the president say he supports cuts to Social Security and Medicare.
It's also going to be we're also going to see the strength of Trump's political arm, the $100 million that Elon Musk just donated towards it, the threats to primary if you don't pass, right? The bullying on X, like they're going to try to get Republicans in line to vote for this. It's going to be bloody. I mean, let's just play a game. Like, what percentage chance do you think this will actually pass in the way that it's been promised?
85%, which is the highest I give anything on our side right now. I think the downstroke to not doing it and having the Senate, having the House, and having the White House, and effectively implementing a tax increase is just whatever the alternative to that is. That alternative is untenable for Republicans when they hold all three.
Okay. Governor Armstrong, thank you so much for your time. This was fascinating. I did see that you're trying to get rid of property tax. Is that right?
We have a really, really what I think is a cool property tax proposal out here. We're blessed in that we have a legacy fund with oil and gas tax revenue in it, and we have an opportunity to deliver real tax relief to our citizens, and we're pretty excited about it.
Cool. We'll have to have you on another time as that develops, and we'll check it out and see how that goes.
Perfect.
Please smash that subscribe button if you like this show and share it with your friends. You can find my work at tarapalmeri.com. Please sign up for my newsletter, The Red Letter, where you can get all of my insider reporting on the highest levels of power. Please consider becoming a paid subscriber to support my independent journalism. See you again this week.